Steinway Street in the late autumn of 2026 was a grim battlefield of retail ghosts, a strip where the past was being systematically paved over by the frictionless efficiency of the near future. The old family-owned shops, the discount clothing stores, and the humid, dimly lit hookah lounges that had defined this stretch of Astoria for decades were mostly gone now. In their place stood automated micro-fulfillment centers and sleek, windowless storefronts where autonomous delivery vans loaded packages in silence behind frosted glass. The street was cleaner than it had ever been, swept by quiet, disc-shaped sidewalk sweepers that hummed like oversized vacuums, but it was also completely devoid of character. The air, which once smelled of charcoal-grilled meats, strong espresso, and cheap cologne, now carried only the faint, sterile scent of ozone and the damp, cold wind blowing off the East River. Destiny Cohen walked with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas jacket, his collar turned up against the chill. He was heading south toward Broadway, past the shuttered, decaying marquee of the old United Artists Theater. The theater, where generations of Astoria locals had once watched movies, had been gutted and converted into a high-capacity charging depot for commercial logistics drones. Overhead, the sky was a gray, featureless sheet, crisscrossed by the invisible flight paths of octocopters carrying groceries and electronics to high-rises in Long Island City. The soft, high-pitched whine of their electric motors was a constant drone, a digital mosquito buzz that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. Destiny kept his head down, focusing on the cracked pavement beneath his boots, trying to ignore the sterile, automated world humming all around him. He felt like a ghost himself, an analog signal passing through a digital fiber optic cable. Everyone he passed seemed to be locked inside their own private, curated bubble of reality. A group of college students stood on the corner of 31st Avenue, their eyes glazed over and reflecting the faint blue light of their augmented reality glasses. They were synchronized, swaying in unison to a shared advertisement that projected a virtual pop star dancing in the middle of the intersection. The hologram was flawless, its movements smoothed by predictive algorithms, casting no real shadows on the asphalt. The students laughed and swiped at the air, interacting with invisible menus. They didn't see the actual trash blowing across the pavement or the gray sky overhead, they only saw the high-resolution, zero-latency rendering of a corporate dream. Destiny looked away, his eyes finding a discarded paper coffee cup tumbling along the curb. He preferred the trash. It was real. It had weight, a physical trajectory determined by the wind rather than a rendering engine. As he walked, his mind drifted back to a debate he had gotten into with Sarah Jenkins just a few months ago in her damp apartment on 30th Drive. They had been sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by a chaotic tangle of patch cables and half-assembled Eurorack modules, drinking lukewarm beer. Sarah, who was working as a contract developer for Olga Records, had been showing off a new Python script she had written. The script connected a fast MCP server to the Lyria 3 model API, allowing her to send structured JSON payloads containing text descriptions and receive high-fidelity, synthesized audio stems back in seconds. "Look at this, Destiny," Sarah had said, her fingers flying over her mechanical keyboard as she launched the local server. "I can query the ComfyUI latent space directly. I pass a simple JSON payload specifying the sample rate, the noise schedule, and the prompt, and the server spits out a perfect, 3-minute ambient path. No ground loops, no hardware hum, no physical limitations. It's pure, mathematical sound generated directly from the latent space of stable audio. Why would you waste hours patching cables and soldering jacks when you can program the exact sound you want in a Python script?" She had leaned back, her face illuminated by the glow of her dual monitors, looking at him with the smug satisfaction of a programmer who had automated away a tedious human task. Destiny had shaken his head, taking a slow sip of his beer. "Because it's sterile, Sarah. It's too perfect. Your script is generating an average of 1,000 other sounds. The latent space is a statistical cage. It doesn't know what it feels like to have a speaker cone rattle because of a loose ground wire. It doesn't understand the physical lag of an old hardware sampler. When you sequence a beat on an MPC and set the swing to 58%, it's not just a mathematical delay of every second 16th note. It's a physical push and pull against the grid, a micro-timing error that feels like a human heart beating. The limitations of the hardware, the fact that you only have 2 megabytes of RAM and have to sample at 22 kHz just to fit a breakbeat into memory, that is where the groove lives. In the constraints. In the dirt. You're trying to filter out the very things that make music feel alive." Sarah had laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Dirt is just noise, Destiny. Noise is an error. It's a loss of information. We've spent 50 years of digital audio engineering trying to get rid of noise, and you want to drag us back to the stone age of tape hiss and bad grounding. Noise isn't an error, Destiny had replied, his voice rising slightly. It's the carrier wave of human emotion. The noise floor is where the ghost lives. If you remove all the friction, you remove the humanity. When you make everything zero latency and noise-free, you're not making music anymore, you're just generating clean data. And nobody ever cried listening to a spreadsheet. They had argued for another hour, neither yielding an inch, their debate eventually dissolving into the hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of an ambulance on Astoria Boulevard. Remembering that argument made the cold wind feel a little sharper. Destiny pulled his collar tighter and stopped just past 31st Avenue. Tucked between a store that sold curated digital wall art, which was nothing more than high-priced TV screens displaying looping generative color fields, and an automated soy latte kiosk where a mechanical arm moved behind plexiglass, was an anomaly, AL's Electronics and Pawn. It was a narrow, deep storefront that seemed to exist in a permanent pocket of 1998, resisting the digital gentrification of the neighborhood. The window was crammed with actual, physical things, stacked high and dusty. There were old SLR cameras, vintage guitar pedals, stacks of old vinyl records with faded, water-damaged covers, and a pile of obsolete video game consoles that smelled of old solder and degrading plastic. He stared through the glass at the chaotic display. A vintage Boss HM2 heavy metal pedal sat on top of a Tascam Portastudio 424 4-track cassette recorder. The pedal's orange knobs were chipped and faded, and the Tascam's plastic chassis was scratched and yellowed by decades of exposure to sunlight. Next to them was a dusty Canon AE-1 camera, its leatherette grip peeling at the edges, and a stack of cathode ray tube monitors with beige plastic cases that had turned the color of old teeth. A neon sign in the window, shaped like a jagged bolt of lightning, flickered with a desperate, buzzing warmth. It emitted a low-frequency hum that Destiny could feel in his collarbones. We buy and sell everything. It was a beacon of the analog world, a sanctuary for things that had ceased to be useful to the modern grid. Destiny pushed the heavy glass door open. A mechanical bell chimed overhead, a real metal bell, brass and slightly tarnished, not a synthesized sample played through a motion-activated speaker. The air inside the shop was thick, cool, and static, smelling of dust, engine oil, heated flux, and old paper. The transition from the high-frequency hiss of the drone propellers outside to the dead, heavy acoustics of the shop was jarring. The noise of the street immediately cut out, replaced by the faint, rhythmic ticking of an old wall clock and the low hum of a soldering iron heating up behind the wooden counter. It felt like stepping into a tomb, or a museum of a civilization that had forgotten how to make things with buttons. Behind the counter sat Al, a man who looked like he had been constructed out of leather, tobacco smoke, and lead solder. He was 70 if he was a day, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a pair of magnifying glasses pushed up onto his bald head. His workspace was a cluttered mess of tools, a Weller soldering iron resting in its metal stand, spools of leaded solder wire, a magnifying lamp, and an old Tektronix oscilloscope displaying a green, gently drifting sine wave. He was working on the circuit board of an old stereo receiver, a Marantz 2270, its silver faceplate reflecting the yellow light of the shop. He didn't look up when Destiny entered, his calloused hand steady as he applied a drop of solder to a capacitor. "If you're here to sell a phone, don't bother," Al said, his voice like two bricks grinding together, dry and gravelly from decades of smoking. "Unless it's an old Nokia. I don't touch anything with an operating system newer than 2015. They're not electronics. They're just spy devices disguised as consumer goods, designed to report your location to a server farm in Virginia every time you take a breath. No schematics, no user-serviceable parts, just proprietary screws and glue. I don't waste my solder on them." "I'm not selling," Destiny said, his voice sounding surprisingly quiet in the dead acoustic space of the shop. "Good," Al muttered, his soldering iron touching a joint, releasing a small curl of gray, sweet-smelling rosin smoke. "Then look around. Just don't break anything." Destiny began to wander down the narrow, cluttered aisles. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, a satisfyingly physical sound. The shelves were packed with forgotten technology, a graveyard of creative tools. He saw a Roland Juno 106 synthesizer that had been stripped of its side panels, its naked circuit boards exposed like ribs, waiting for voice chips that were no longer manufactured. He saw a Yamaha DX7 with its membrane keys worn down to the metal, and a chaotic heap of tangled cables, including TRS, XLR, and old 5-pin DIN MIDI cables, which were coiled like sleeping snakes in a plastic bin. He touched the keys of an old electric piano, feeling the heavy, mechanical action of the keys, the way the hammer struck imaginary tines in the silence. Then, on a bottom shelf near the very back of the shop, under a stack of old electronics manuals and a dusty reel-to-reel tape recorder, he saw it. It was a heavy, square machine, finished in a textured, dark gray casing. It had a row of 16 large, square rubber pads, arranged in a perfect 4x4 grid. Next to the pads was a small, high-contrast touchscreen and a series of heavy aluminum knobs that felt like they belonged on a piece of military radar equipment. It was an Akai MPC, specifically, an MPC Live 2, a standalone music production workstation that had been released in the early 2020s. It was a machine designed to be the center of a hardware-based studio, a sampler and sequencer that didn't need a computer to function. Destiny knelt on the dusty linoleum floor, his knees complaining with a dull ache as he reached under the shelf to pull the machine out. He had to use both hands. It was heavy, weighing nearly 10 pounds, its solid metal chassis and thick rubber feet built to withstand the abuse of live touring and late-night studio sessions. As he lifted it, the weight felt reassuringly solid, a stark contrast to the featherlight, disposable plastic devices of 2026. He wiped a thick layer of gray dust off the top panel with his sleeve, revealing the textured, rubberized surface of the chassis. The 16 pads were slightly yellowed with age, but they were intact, their borders clean and defined. Destiny ran his fingers over the rubber pads. They felt solid, tactile, and incredibly satisfying to touch. Unlike the cold, friction-free glass screens of his phone and laptop, these pads had texture, a subtle grip that caught the pads of his fingers. They had physical resistance. They were designed to be hit, to be played with force and expression. He pressed one down, feeling the thick rubber compress and then spring back up with a silent, tactile rebound. He tested the 4 Q-link knobs on the right side of the machine. They were capacitive touch and turned with a smooth, heavy resistance, allowing for precise adjustments without the sudden, digital jumps of a mouse pointer. The master volume knob turned with a mechanical stiffness that felt expensive, a physical potentiometer that directly controlled the analog output stage. He pressed his fingers against the other buttons, note repeat, 16 levels, full level, timing correct. Each button gave a distinct, mechanical click, a physical confirmation of input. He closed his eyes and imagined using them. He could picture himself routing audio from an old turntable into the stereo inputs, adjusting the input gain until the peak LEDs flickered red, and sampling a dusty drum break. He could see himself using the Q-links to slice the sample into individual hits, assigning the kick, snare, and hi-hat to the rubber pads. With 16 levels engaged, he could map a single sample across all 16 pads, varying the velocity or filter cutoff for each one to create a dynamic, human performance. He could use the note repeat button to roll hi-hats, adjusting the swing percentage to 58% or 62% to give the rhythm that signature, drunken stumble. Ah, AL's voice sounded from behind him. You found the beat maker. Destiny looked up. Al had put down his soldering iron and was leaning against the counter. Does it work? Destiny asked. Works perfectly, Al said. Some developer kid brought it in 6 months ago. He tried to use it to control some generative audio stack running Python scripts and FastMCP servers. He wanted the pads to trigger latent space-stable audio models via JSON payloads in ComfyUI, but the local latency drove him crazy. The machine wouldn't sync with his cloud automation, so he got frustrated and sold it to me for $50. He wanted a remote control for a server farm, not a sampler. I cleaned the pots, replaced the battery, and loaded it with classic drum samples, Al continued. It's a tank. How much? 250. Destiny winced. I've got 180. And that's pushing it. Al stared at him, then squinted. Wait. You're the kid from the podcast, aren't you? Destiny Cohen. The one who did the episode about the noise floor. I liked that show. You understand that silence isn't just zero. It's got texture and dirt. Today, they want everything sterile, like a hospital hallway. No mistakes, no life. Al tossed the power brick into a canvas bag. 180. But promise me you'll make something with some dirt on it. Deal. Deal, Destiny said, handing over his last bills. Al stuffed the money into an old cash register that opened with a loud, mechanical ping. Destiny zipped the MPC into the canvas bag and hoisted the heavy strap onto his shoulder. As he stepped back out onto Steinway Street, the wind was still cold and the automated drone charging lights still cast their sterile glow, but he felt anchored. The physical weight of the machine against his side was a reassuring presence. He walked back to his apartment with a quicker pace, ignoring the vibrations of his phone. For the first time in a year, he felt ready to create. He was going to make some noise, and he couldn't wait to start.